Welcome to Overcoming Implicit Racial Bias. My name is Karen Fleshman, and I'm a racial equity trainer and attorney. And I'm so grateful for you for making time to really go deep into this very important topic. There has never been a better time to work on overcoming implicit racial bias than now. And I hope you'll grab a notebook and turn off all distractions so we can really go deep into this subject. How this is going to work today, we're going to give an overview of what implicit racial bias is and how it works. And then we're going to move from awareness of our bias into overcoming our bias. We'll start by really getting into what is the right mindset for doing this work. And then we'll talk about race and how to have a productive conversation about race, and end with how we can have a positive impact in our spheres of influence. So first, let's really start to unpack what is implicit racial bias and how does it work? Every moment of the day, our brains are being inundated by 11 million bits of information, but we can only process about 40 bits of information. In order to go into total overwhelm and just shut down, we've created mental shortcuts, ways for our brains to really quickly sort information, like whether someone is good or bad, whether they're pretty or ugly, whether they're smart or dumb, whether they're trustworthy or scary, whether they're competent or incompetent. And these shortcuts work extremely efficiently, extremely fast, but they can enter a lot of errors into our decision making because a lot of them are framed by stereotypes. So what is implicit bias? Is the attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding, actions, and decisions in an unconscious manner, acted involuntarily and without our awareness or intentional control. Oftentimes, we can have really deep-seated beliefs that are one way, but our unconscious mind is actually operating in a very different way from what our deep-seated beliefs are. And these things start to form very early in life. I'm the mother of two young children, and I'm amazed at how quickly implicit racial bias is forming in their minds and how we have to constantly be working at it to dispel the stereotypes that they're drinking in every day. I want you to close your eyes and picture, what is a racist? What does a racist look like? What association do you have with that? Now, for many of us, we may have this image, right? This is what I learned about growing up, what a racist looks like. Someone who is backwards, poorly educated, operates during cover of night and under disguise because their views are so despised by society, very hateful, violent. Basically all these extremely negative qualities, none of which I associate with myself. So because I didn't have those qualities, therefore, I must not be a racist. And for many white friends of mine, this is the way we are sort of raised to believe. But what if I told you a racist could actually look like this? And this is my family in our full 1970s regalia. I'm outing myself, dating myself, as you can see. But what is really clear, my parents were lovely people. They raised me to believe that all people are equal, that racism is terrible, Dr. Martin Luther King is awesome. But a few things also occurred during my childhood, messages I received from my parents about race. Number one, I never once saw my parents interact with a person of color. We just didn't know any. We never went to any people of color's homes. We never had people of color into our homes. So while my parents espoused, that racism was bad, I never really saw them interact with people. This was largely because we lived in a town where there were virtually no people of color. There were two black students in my high school. And growing up, I'm not quite sure, if I ever really thought about that. I thought, if at all, I would think that, maybe people of color just don't want to live in our town. It was only recently that I came to understand that my town was a sundown town, meaning that was a place where people of color could not rent, could not own. They could not even stay in a hotel overnight. They had to literally be out of our town by sundown. And this was really a very widespread practice. There were sundown towns all throughout the United States. In Warmth of Other Suns, one of the characters moves from Louisiana to Los Angeles in one drive because he can't stay in a hotel in a single town along the highway. So that was the second thing I learned from my parents. The last part was I'm not quite sure if I ever asked my parents about why is there racial inequality in our society. But if I did, I think the message that I got back from them was, well, we used to have really terrible racism in our society, but then we had a civil rights movement, and now basically everybody is equal. And some folks choose to avail themselves of opportunities, and other people don't. So that's on them. But as for us and our family, we work really hard to give you guys the opportunities that you have. I didn't really, this message was very widespread in families like mine. And because, like I said, we didn't know any people of color, almost all of my associations of people of color were formed through media. So, for example, we watched these movies in my elementary school trying to discourage us from using drugs that featured a lot of people of color having ODs. So it was a very negative images that we were exposed to without having very many interpersonal relationships to counteract those images. Later in life, I've lived in Austin, Texas, in Washington, D.C., in New York City, and now I live here in San Francisco. And in all three of those cities, I've observed the exact same trends. Limitless career opportunities for white, college-educated, middle-class people like me who flock to these cities to pursue our careers, while many people of color who were born and raised in these cities subsist in chronic joblessness and underemployment. And I really dedicated my career to trying to change that. I worked for a wonderful organization called Year Up. Year Up trains young adults who are disconnected from the economic mainstream for corporate careers in technology. And here you see me with Anthony Josie, one of my mentees from Year Up. I formed relationships with hundreds of young adults like Anthony across the country working for this organization. And it was really in those conversations I had with my mentees that I got a totally different picture about how race really operates in our society. First of all, they dispelled my negative stereotypes of what they would be like. They were intelligent and warm and funny and loving, and I couldn't believe they had such a negative association. When you got to know them, you're like, oh my God, these people are, just incredible. The other thing was just hearing the way that race impacted their life made me very cognizant of how my race impacted my life. So hearing about their encounters with law enforcement made me realize, hey, wait a second, my encounters with law enforcement are very different from that. But I would think that was normal if I hadn't listened to their stories about what they had experienced. But I also, no matter how grateful they were for launching these new careers and going on to earn really good salaries and have really nice lifestyles, they consistently experienced so much discrimination. And it made me really understand that our country is full of people like me who grew up kind of in isolation from people of color and now work in environments where we're working alongside one another, but we don't really understand how to do that very well. And that's why I've shifted my focus to racial bias training and helping people not only have awareness of implicit racial bias, but actually move from awareness to action and accountability. And I'd like to talk about that a little bit now. The intersection between systemic racism and implicit racial bias. They feed off of each other and harm everyone. So, because we don't have many close personal relationships with people, we develop implicit racial bias. And then because we live in segregation from one another, there's systemic racism. And all of that starts to feed off of each other, resulting in more and more and more until we decide to disrupt this cycle. Communities of color are growing. Our population in the United States is changing very dramatically. And I think about this a lot, like I said, with my young children, that when they're in the peak of their careers, people of color will actually make up the majority of our society. So I think it's in everyone's self-interest to prepare for the change in our demographics and to really develop a greater way of understanding one another. Now, I could highlight many different slides to demonstrate the impact that systemic racism has in our society. But that's not really the purpose of today's webinar. The purpose today is to understand systemic racism, implicit racial bias, and work on overcoming our bias. But I want to highlight this one because I think out of all the indicators I could point to, this is the one that tells us the most. This is the difference in the amount of net wealth of families, white families, and Black families, and Latino families. And you see in the slide that it's actually growing, the gap. Between 2010 and 2013, the gap between the net worth of white families and the net worth of Black and Latino families actually grew to where now white families have on average $141,000 when you take all their assets and subtract all their liabilities. And Black families have $11,000 on average when you do that. And that's 13 times. It would take the average Black family 228 years to earn as much as the average white family has right now. And when you think about that, what does that mean? 13 times the amount of time to spend with your kids, 13 times the amount of resources to send your kid to summer camp and provide all kinds of enrichment activities for them. And so it becomes this kind of self-fulfilling cycle where the white families are able to invest more in their kids and set them up for success, as well as the kids inherit wealth from their parents, and thus this gap just continues to widen again until we start to disrupt that. I want to talk now about how implicit racial bias shows up in the workplace and how it really harms everybody. I'd like to highlight the situation faced by Dr. Tamika Cross. Some of you may have read Dr. Cross's Facebook post that went viral. So she's a medical doctor on a flight. She sees a passenger having an emergency, and she jumps up and says, "Hey, I want to go help that passenger." That is her duty as a doctor. And the flight attendant comes to her and says, "Oh no, sweetie, put your hand down. We are looking for actual physicians." So I want you to think for a moment, who were all of the parties who were harmed by that flight attendant's bias, right? You have the passenger, the ill passenger who's not getting medical attention that he needs. You have Dr. Tamika Cross, who is suffering a very painful and humiliating experience. You have the flight attendant who is going to be reprimanded for what she did. You have the other passengers who are traumatized watching this. You have the Delta brand that, all these people reading this Facebook post spawned a hashtag, what a doctor looks like. There's many different parties that were harmed here by the flight attendant's bias. And it actually led to the CEO of Delta, apologizing to Dr. Cross and issuing a new policy that from here on, no medical professional would be required to demonstrate credentials in order to provide medical assistance on a flight in an emergency. So this situation of Dr. Cross reminds me of one of my favorite authors and one of the favorite things I've heard her say. Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie has a wonderful TED Talk about the single story, and I encourage you to watch that TED Talk. But she says the problem with stereotypes is not that they are untrue, but that they are incomplete. They make one story become the only story. So what we're going to talk about in just a minute is how to overcome our implicit racial bias by filling our minds with many stories, not just one story about people. And I also want to point out that the harm caused by the flight attendants, whether or not it was intentional, was very real. I think sometimes in the whole conversation about implicit racial bias, we can get too hung up on the fact that it's implicit or unconscious and not really focusing on, for Dr. Cross or for that passenger, it didn't matter that it was unconscious. The harm that it caused them was very, very real. Without intentional disruption, systemic racism and implicit racial bias form this vicious cycle, and they just keep going and going. But we can interrupt, we can end this cycle. I love this quote from Frederick Douglass. He said, "Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never has, and it never will." So if we're going to disrupt this very powerful dynamic, we have to have a clear demand. We have to really understand what's going on and be forceful in the change that we want to see. And I'd like to point out that racial bias is very powerful, but it is not inevitable. And it is something that we can overcome. And that's what I'd like to focus on for the rest of our time together. We're going to talk now for the rest of our time together on how to move from awareness of racial bias to overcoming implicit racial bias. And I'm going to walk you through a 5-step process. It's super important. You cannot pick and choose to do just one of these things. Because that dynamic of implicit racial bias and systemic racism is so powerful, if you just do one of these things, it's not going to interrupt it. You have to do all 5. So please bear with me and let's work through these steps together. And let's not only learn about them, let's actually implement them in our lives. The truth about our society is that we love to point the finger and say, hey, those bad people over there, they need to change. But very few of us are willing to look ourselves in the mirror and say, how am I contributing to this? And what do I need to do to change myself? And that's where most of our power actually lies. So the first step I'm going to talk about is how to achieve the right mindset so that you can do this work effectively. I love this quote from Lao Tzu. I won't read it. I'll let you read to yourself. Just take a minute and drink what Lao Tzu has to say in. When we transform ourselves, we start to transform the world around us. And what I want us to think about is how can we adopt a growth mindset? This is from Stanford professor Carol Dweck's work on growth mindset. So what does she mean by that? She means a growth mindset is when you look at failure as an opportunity to grow, and that when you make a mistake, you don't stop. You learn from it. You don't get ashamed by it. You keep going. You take the lessons from the mistake and keep going, as opposed to a fixed mindset where you say, oh, this is the way it's always been, this is how it's going to always be, and this is the only way it can be. And if you make a mistake, you use it as a signal to stop, that it's impossible to change. So Transforming our racial biases, extremely hard work. If we don't adopt a growth mindset, we're not going to succeed. And we will make mistakes along the way. That's part of the process. Don't let those mistakes impede us from moving forward. Carol Dweck's work shows that when we feed our brains positive associations, we really can transform them. Our brains are like these incredible instruments that are highly malleable, and we can direct them the way we want to. I also want to talk about what I call the freight train of negative emotions triggered by having this conversation. So in my work with clients, oftentimes, when we start to have this conversation, the people of color in the conversation can have very strong negative emotional responses, or oftentimes positive ones too, because they're happy that we're finally having this conversation. But they can also provoke extreme pain and a lot of suffering and evoke some really painful memories for them. For the white people who participate in my workshops, they can also have some very negative emotions where they feel intense shame or guilt or denial. Sometimes they'll get into an argument like they just don't want to believe that this stuff actually exists, even though it's been scientifically proven that it does exist. And so once that starts to happen, it derails the whole conversation. So what I encourage people to do is when you start to have a strong negative reaction to something, an emotional reaction, pay attention to the emotional reaction and what's triggering it. Try to focus on what's triggering it and what you can learn from that instead of going off on this emotional freight train that can really stop the conversation. And I really want to talk a little bit about guilt. So when I first became aware of all of the damage caused by racism, I felt intensely guilty. I think that's normal. It's a very, very horrible thing that has happened for a very long time. But I realized that dwelling in guilt is not going to get us anywhere. That I had to process that guilt, overcome that guilt, and work through that with myself so that I could move into action and accountability. And now, when I hear or see something that triggers those feelings of guilt, I think about, okay, what action can I take? What is within my sphere of control that I can do to contribute to a different result? And I focus on doing that. No one wants our guilt. It doesn't get us anywhere. And also, when we operate from a mindset of guilt, we're not going to be effective at solving these problems. So when you start to feel guilt, process it, but don't dwell in it and don't try and move forward until you have processed it. So here's some tips on achieving the right mindset for overcoming implicit racial bias. As I said, when you start to have an intense emotional reaction, pay attention to it because that's often where you need to do the most work. Also, the people who trigger intense emotional reactions are often the people who have the most to teach us because they are presenting us with a nugget of truth that is extremely painful for us to hear. That is why we are having that emotional reaction to them. So think about what you can learn from that. Don't deny the power of what they're trying to tell you. Think of every conversation as an opportunity to learn. As I mentioned, we will make mistakes. That's part of this process. When you do, apologize. Okay? Learn from the mistake and then move forward. Don't let these mistakes prevent you from even getting started in the first place. That, I think, is one of our biggest impediments when it comes to race, is that we're so afraid of saying the wrong thing that we say nothing at all. And we just keep going on as if this isn't happening. It is happening, and it's up to us to change it. You don't have to agree to have a safe dialogue. This is really, I'm friends with people who have very different viewpoints from mine, but we talk about our differences and we still like each other. We still are working towards similar goals with one another. We just have different viewpoints about how to do it. This is really important, though, um, to continue the relationship even when you don't actually agree. And also, lastly, I'm going to say you have to take care of yourself in order to do this work really well. You have to rest and eat well and be present and not have distractions and be feeling positive as you start to do this work so that you can be fully present and you can really do the work. So once we've achieved the right mindset, then we need to start to reflect on ourselves. And when we talk about bias, we talk about in groups and out groups. So they experience bias in different ways. The in group is the dominant, more powerful group. And when it comes to implicit racial bias, how it affects those in the in group is it causes them to feel superior. For outgroup members, the subordinate, less powerful group, implicit racial bias can cause them to lose confidence and to disengage. So again, you see this vicious cycle forming where like the in-group thinks subconsciously, oh, I'm superior, and the out-group starts to feel more and more uh, questioning their own capability and losing confidence. So it creates another vicious cycle. I want you to spend some time on self-reflection, and I'm going to send you after this links to the implicit association test, as well as the racial inclusion self-assessment, which is a little booklet I've developed. You can sit down with a cup of coffee and a pen and really reflect on yourself and write answers in that book. That's going to help guide the rest of your journey. The goal of doing this work is to understand how bias affects you and against whom you are biased. So the implicit association test is this wonderful free resource. You can test yourself in many different characteristics. Do I have implicit bias against folks who have this characteristic? And I encourage you to take these tests so you can start to identify who against whom you are biased, as well as who is underrepresented in your social network. And all that is going to be important as we move into step 3. So the next thing I want you to do is to start to intentionally expand your network to folks who against whom you have bias. So you'll take some implicit association test. Oh, I have bias against Asian Americans. You'll start to then increase your relationships by networking with Asian Americans. And this is exactly what I mean about taking those stereotypes, those negative associations we have in our head, and replacing them with positive images, because you're sitting down, you're actually getting to know other people and know them as human beings and hear their stories. And so it's not going to be a single story anymore that you have ruminating in your head, but you will have many stories of individuals with this characteristic and start to develop positive associations. The other thing that will be really beneficial is when you start to expand your network, then you're sharing social capital with folks outside of your current network. This is how a lot of our opportunities get presented to us, is through our social network. And when our social networks are very homogenous, that means folks who outside of them aren't getting access to opportunities, perpetuating inequality. So when we're talking about how to intentionally expand our social network, here are some tips that I have for you. One is, while you're doing this, be mindful of your media consumption. Going back to what I was saying earlier, that a lot of these negative images occur because of things we're seeing in the media. So you don't want to be counteracting the work that you're doing to dispel stereotypes by imbibing more stereotypes. Go to a different neighborhood, okay? Because we live in racial segregation, um, If we only stay in our neighborhood, our social networks will likely be very homogenous. But whatever it is we like to do, maybe you like to play chess, maybe you like to go hiking, maybe you like to scrapbook. I personally like to do Zumba. So I intentionally take Zumba classes in neighborhoods of people of color. And I don't just go one time. I go over and over and over again, and just hanging out before and after Zumba class and going to other activities that I learn about through the class, I start to build my social network in these neighborhoods. I also encourage you, if you really want to meet people, probably the best way is to go places by yourself. Because if you go with a friend, you're more likely to be talking with your friend and less likely to be talking with the people you encounter along the way. When you meet people, be inquisitive. Just start asking them questions. Everyone loves to tell their story. And I love listening to people's stories. That's how um, how I develop empathy with people is by really understanding, oh, wow, where are you from? And what are some significant events that have happened in your life that have sort of framed your journey? I love people asking those kinds of questions and really getting to know them. I also encourage you to exchange information and initiate follow up. So, our social networks are not going to change of their own volition. You're going to have to put some intentionality and some effort into it, but I promise you it will pay off. And I'm such a deep believer in this. I'm going to issue a 30-day challenge. Okay, so circle the date in your calendar 30 days from now, and I want you by then to have taken the implicit association test and done the racial inclusion self assessment, and then to have at least once gone out and intentionally tried to expand your network with folks against whom you are biased. And so what am I talking about here? What are some things you could do in the next 30 days? For example, you could go to a Dr. Martin Luther King Day celebration. Or maybe your implicit bias is against Chinese people. You could go to Chinese New Year's celebration. Or like I said, go take a Zumba class in a neighborhood where you're likely to meet a lot of people of color who reside in that neighborhood. Or maybe you're a person of color and you're looking to expand your social network into a white neighborhood. All those types of things. But within the next 30 days, intentionally try to do that. Now, step 4, learn how to talk about race productively. And this is so important. When we start to talk about race, oftentimes the conversation will shut down because people don't want to hear about the pain that racism caused. We deny pain. We say, "Oh, that can't possibly be true because that's not my experience." Guess what, folks? It's someone else's experience, and we have to open our ears and our hearts and minds to hear their experience. So, what I want to encourage you to do is do empathetic listening. As you're hearing this story, don't try and shut it down. Put yourself in their shoes. Listen with the goal of learning something. Ask questions. And when you ask questions, really listen. Establishing a connection with that person. People remember people that they establish connections with. And welcome it. Don't shy away from it, but don't initiate there. So the 5th step is absolutely the most important one. All of these other things are great, transforming yourself and expanding your social network so that you can dispel your stereotypes and have productive conversations about race. But unless and until we get to changing our sphere of influence, the implicit racial bias systemic racism cycle will just continue to flourish. It's that powerful. But when each of us takes one step in our sphere of influence to change it up, that's how we will disrupt this cycle throughout our society. So, what do I mean by that? Everybody has a sphere of influence, right? It could be our workplace, it could be our kids' school, it could be a club or some kind of social group that we are part of. Everybody, in some way, is part of something over which they have power. It could be your family, right? So think about in your sphere of influence, what is something that you can change? And I'll give you an example. So here in San Francisco, in December 2015, the police shot and killed a young man, Mario Woods, and it was recorded on videotape. And it was so disturbing, this video of Mario, that I just became very, very angry. And I got very involved in what's a coalition of folks working to hold police accountable. And we worked so hard. We went to so many different police commission meetings and testified and really demanded that our oversight body of our police set a higher standard of behavior of police so that no death like Mario's would occur in the future. And just recently, we got this new use of force policy adopted, even though the police officers union was very, very opposed to it and had a lot of resources and did a whole media campaign and a political campaign. We, this group of activists with almost no resources, were able to persuade the government officials to change the policy. And I think this is so important. We have so much power, particularly with our local public officials. And I want to encourage you to go to Board of Education meetings and Planning Commission meetings and speak your voice. You can influence decisions. And so that's going to be part of another challenge I want you to do within the next 60 days is think about what is one change I can make, either in my faith-based organization, in my kids' school, at my workplace. And it doesn't have to be something monumental like changing a use of force policy. I'll give you another example. My kids' school has a high number of Muslim families, so a bunch of parents got together and organized a breakfast to just share with our Muslim families how much we care about them, how welcome they are at the school, and how we stand in solidarity with them as they experience a lot of discrimination. We are there for them. So it can be something as simple as that. Or maybe at your workplace, you have a colleague who's consistently talked over. Perhaps next time that happens, you can stand up and say, hey, I think we need to actually listen to what she is saying. She's contributing a very valuable idea here. Let's let her present her full idea. There's all different ways we can intervene in our spheres of influence. And I want to particularly encourage you to think about how you can get other people in your spheres of influence to participate in this with you. It's through this ripple effect that we will start to really see a transformation in our society. So just to recap, the goal of this webinar is to understand implicit racial bias and how it works, and then to move beyond that awareness to actually overcoming our bias by developing the right mindset, learning how to have productive conversations about race, and having a positive impact in our spheres of influence. So I hope we've achieved all of those for you. And please do give me your feedback. I appreciate hearing from you about that. Some final thoughts. Racism will not end from the top down, but from the bottom up. I think this is so important. If just changing laws were enough, we would not be in the situation that we're in right now in our society 50 years after the civil rights movement laws changed. We need to change our hearts. We need to change our minds. We need to change our behaviors. And the government is not going to tell us how to do that. That has to come from us. That has to come from me and you. And people like you and me, when we start to change our behavior, that's going to bubble up and be the change in our society that we need to see. I love this quote from Nelson Mandela. I keep this next to my bed. I think about it all the time. It always seems impossible until it's done. And you think about Nelson Mandela, 28 years in prison, the absolute monumental undertaking of dismantling an entire system, and how impossible and futile that must have felt, but he just kept at it. And that is the most important thing. Don't let pain points or mistakes or whatever impede you from keeping going. The key to effective resistance is persistence. You just got to keep at it. I love this tweet because it is so true. Ordinary people are the ones who change the world. The Rosa Parks of this world, the Harvey Milks, the people who wake up one day and say, you know what, this is so crazy, I'm just not going to go along with it anymore. And I'm going to do what I can to transform it. And they inspire other people to also make those changes. Again, the change does not come from on high. The change bubbles up from us. Thank you again so much for joining us. And I hope that this was beneficial to you. I would love your feedback. Please do keep in touch with me. There's many ways you can work with me as well. I offer an online course on overcoming racism where we go much more deep into these topics, as well as do a lot of role plays and feedback sessions and things like that, so that you can actually practice different skills and develop your skills in this area. I also give in-person workshops where I help companies and nonprofits and government agencies better work together and better serve their clients and the public by overcoming racial bias. And to conclude, I just want to offer some answers to some questions that I got when I gave this webinar live. So the first question I got was how to talk about race at work. And I think this is so important. Again, work seems like an uncomfortable place to talk about race, but we got to do it. So I suggest talking about it proactively, establishing relationships before times of conflict happen, and being open about it in a company and saying, obviously there's some challenge in our society and within ourselves and our company with regard to race, and we want to hear from people about how we can do things better. And giving tools, one of the things that I help my clients to do is learn how to give feedback. When you witness someone in the workplace either committing a microaggression against somebody else, or if someone commits a microaggression against you, how to provide feedback to that person so that they can grow and transform, things of that nature. So I do encourage people to talk about race at work and to build relationships, interracial friendships at work by, actively engaging, asking people out for coffee, having lunch together, whatever the case may be. Work gives us a great opportunity to expand our social network with folks who are currently underrepresented. And again, it's those relationships that are going to lead to real change in our society. Another question I got was how to expand our network without tokenizing people, i.e., oh, let me go out and make a Native American friend, which seems extremely awkward, right? No one wants to be, recruited to fill some kind of quota in one's social network. That's not what I'm talking about. What I am saying is that because of systemic racism and segregation, our social networks are going to remain very homogenous unless we intentionally go outside of them and bring new people in. I'm not saying, oh, tokenize someone or say, oh, but to be really strategic about the way we initiate relationships and bring people into our social network. In the end, I'm just Karen Fleshman, and that other person is just who he or she is. It's not, symbolic or representative of this entire group of people. I also encourage you to develop many relationships, not just one friend from a certain group, but as many friends from that group as you possibly can. Because again, it's about filling our mind with different stories about who these folks are, as well as sharing our social capital beyond the folks with whom we're currently sharing. Another question I got, which I thought was fantastic, is how to engage in activism without being a helper. And I really want to talk to this point, especially for white women. A lot of white women, like myself, we're raised, the way we express our concern about things is by helping. We see people in pain and we want to go help them. And that can often be the way that we approach our relationships with people of color or people who experience a lot of disadvantage. When white people and people of color work together to solve racism, it's liberating us both. And it's not that the white people are there to help, it's actually transformative for us as well. The whole helper paradigm is kind of a dominant subordinate one that is very much like racism, right? Where like the white people have all the answers and we're there to help the poor people of color. We don't want that. That is not beneficial to anyone. So step outside of helper mentality and step into, I don't even like the word ally. I like the word partner. Because to me, ally is like, oh, what's in your strategic interest and my strategic interest? Then in those situations, we'll collaborate. I don't believe in that. I believe that my liberation is very much bound up in the freedom of other people. And so I want to work together and partner with them in seeing how we can all be liberated. Until all of us are free, none of us are free. That's the paradigm that I operate from. The last question I got is, should white people be doing this work? And I absolutely believe we should get as many people to do this work as possible. We have such a monumental problem. We need to have as many folks engaged in it as possible. Now, that said, I don't think you should just run out tomorrow and start calling yourself a racial equity trainer. I think you really need to spend a lot of time understanding this stuff and deeply engaged in it before you can start training other people in how to overcome it. And I definitely collaborate. I work in collaboration with other trainers of color all the time because I think it's very important that a full perspective on how racism operates be presented. Now, I will say this, 9 times out of 10, when a white friend invites me to a birthday party or a social event, a happy hour, almost all of the people there are white, with maybe a few Asian people. And so I have access to social environments, and I bring all my anti-racism training into those social environments and try to influence them. So I think it's really important for white people doing this work to influence other white people in our spaces to try and bring them along on this journey with us. And if you have more questions for me, you have my contact information. I thank you so much for joining us today. And I hope that you will be in touch about taking my online course and doing some workshops in person. And thank you very